There comes a moment, sometimes expected, often not, when the ground beneath your mind begins to tremble. It's not a breakdown, it's not a crisis, it's something far more permanent. An awakening, not the kind sold on spiritual brochures or whispered through Instagram affirmations. No, this one doesn't arrive gently. It arrives like a storm that tears the roof off your inner house. And in that moment when everything you believed about yourself begins to fracture, you don't feel enlightened, you feel lost. Carl Jung once said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." That's not just a philosophical quote, it's a warning. Because the moment you awaken, you begin to see how little of your life was truly yours. You start to question your desires, your reactions, your identity. You realize your mind has been a puppet, and someone or something else has been pulling the strings all along. People think awakening is peace, light, clarity. Sometimes it is, but first, it's madness. Because before you meet your higher self, you will come face to face with the imposter you've been playing. And that confrontation is not poetic, it's brutal. You look in the mirror and realize you've spent decades performing a role you didn't audition for. You wore a name that wasn't truly yours. You made decisions for a self you hadn't even met yet. This isn't a path paved with certainty. It's a descent, a disintegration. And the mind, the one you once trusted, starts to feel like foreign territory. You question every thought, every reaction. You no longer believe the voice in your head is always right. Sometimes, you don't even know if it's you at all. In this video, we'll walk through that unraveling, through the collapse of the illusion of mental control, through the peeling back of the conditioned layers. This isn't for the faint of heart. This is for those who have tasted the silence beneath their own thoughts and realized that silence was more real than anything they've ever believed. Before the awakening, you believe your thoughts are yours. You believe your mind is a fortress, your private territory. You tell yourself you're in control, that your choices are deliberate, your desires organic. But awakening pulls the curtain back and shows you something far more uncomfortable. Your mind is not your own. Not really. It never was. Most of what you think, feel, and want has been poured into you by society, by family, by unspoken rules you didn't write but somehow learned by heart. From the time you could speak, you were taught how to perform, how to be acceptable, how to be loved. You adopted beliefs that weren't yours. You repeated patterns you never chose. You confused safety with truth. Carl Jung called this the personality mask you wear to face the world, and before awakening, you live behind that mask so long you forget it's not your skin. You play the part society wrote for you, thinking it's your own script. You follow expectations like they're instincts. You chase goals you never questioned, until one day you do. That's when the illusion begins to crack. You start to notice how much of your personality is performance. You realize you've been choosing from a menu of options handed to you, not realizing there was a world beyond the menu. That quiet voice you buried, the one that didn't fit in, that was you all along. And now, it's knocking. You begin to ask yourself dangerous questions. Why do I really want this? Who told me I had to be like this? What if the version of me everyone admires is not who I am at all? And suddenly the mind you once trusted becomes suspect. Your autonomy turns out to be a well-rehearsed pattern of conditioning. You were free, yes, but only within invisible lines. You were choosing, but only from what you'd been trained to choose. That's the shock. Not that you were asleep, but that while sleeping you built an entire life based on dreams that were never your own. Awakening doesn't give you control. It shows you how little you had to begin with. And from that humbling, terrifying place, the real journey begins not to become someone new, but to unearth who you were before the world told you who to be. There's a part of you you've spent a lifetime avoiding. You didn't reject it on purpose. You just learned quietly, over time, that certain feelings, thoughts, and impulses weren't acceptable. So you buried them, repressed them, dismissed them as not me. But they didn't disappear, they waited, and when awakening arrives, so do they. Carl Jung called this the shadow, the hidden, unconscious aspects of ourselves we deny, disown, or feel ashamed of. It's everything we're afraid to admit lives inside us. Anger, envy, lust, neediness, cruelty, fear, not the traits we show the world, the ones we hide, even from ourselves. And here's the paradox. Your shadow holds the key to your freedom. But to claim it, you must first see it, and that's where the pain begins. Because awakening doesn't just open you to light, it opens every locked door, every memory you've minimized, every behavior you've rationalized. It turns your polite self-image upside down and whispers, "Here is the rest of you," and suddenly the ground shakes. You're not who you thought you were. You're far more and far darker than you were ever allowed to be. This confrontation creates chaos, emotional surges, confusion, guilt. You wonder if you're breaking down, but what's really happening is you're breaking open. You begin to notice patterns show, your anger disguises fear, how your judgments mirror your own wounds, how the things you condemned in others were actually hiding inside you all along. You're no longer just living in the world, you're now living with your shadow, and it speaks through triggers, dreams, shame, projections. Every time someone irritates you, every time you overreact, every time you feel something you shouldn't, that's the shadow reaching for the mic. And here's the part no one tells you. Awakening isn't peaceful at first because peace requires truth, and truth requires looking into the mirror and saying, "Yes, that's me too." The shadow doesn't make you bad, it makes you whole, but only if you face it, only if you stop pretending that the light is the only thing you are. Because when the unconscious becomes conscious, you don't just see your wounds, you finally begin to heal them. At first, you think you're just changing, growing, evolving, but then something deeper happens, something irreversible. The stories that once defined you stop making sense. The image you've spent years perfecting begins to collapse, and you realize this isn't transformation, this is demolition. What's breaking isn't just your worldview, it's you, or more precisely, the version of you you've been living through, the character, the costume, the collection of roles and responses designed to keep you accepted, safe, approved of. And awakening doesn't gently ask you to let it go, it rips it from your grip. Jung said, "Enlightenment is not imagining figures of light, but making the darkness conscious." And here's where that becomes real. The moment you wake up, you start to see how much of your life was built on survival, not truth. Your personality wasn't chosen, it was adapted, formed in response to wounds, approval, trauma, and tradition. You believed you were independent, but you were performing. You thought you were making decisions, but you were reacting. You felt strong, but you were armored, and now the armor is melting. This unraveling brings disorientation. You feel emotionally raw, mentally foggy. You don't know who to trust, not even your own thoughts. People around you don't understand because to them, you still look the same. But inside, it feels like you're falling through a trapdoor with no end in sight. You might feel grief, not just for what you've lost, but for how long you lived, disconnected from yourself. You may feel panic because the strategies you used to feel secure no longer work. The smiles, the pleasing, the pushing through, it all feels hollow now, useless. This is the free fall, and yet it's necessary, because the self that breaks here was never truly you. It was scaffolding, a placeholder, a survival mechanism. And now it's outlived its purpose. It's terrifying, yes, but here's the hidden gift. Only when the old self falls apart can the real self begin to emerge, the one not based on expectation or fear but on essence. And though it feels like you're losing everything, what you're actually shedding is the lie. This is the death before rebirth, the undoing before the becoming. And while you may not yet see what's ahead, trust this. What's breaking isn't you, it's the prison that kept you from yourself. Before awakening, you mistake the noise in your head for truth. You believe that what you think is what you believe. But awakening exposes something deeply unsettling. Much of the voice guiding your life isn't even yours. It sounds like you, it lives in your head. But listen closer. Beneath the surface are echoes, your mother's fears, your father's rules, the religion that told you what to repress, the culture that told you what success should look like, the media that taught you who you should want to be and who you should never become. 1,000 voices, stitched together into one script. And you've been reading from it like it's sacred. You say, "I'm not good enough." But whose voice is that really? You think, "I should have a partner by now, a house, a family." But who wrote that timeline? You tell yourself, "Don't be selfish, don't make people uncomfortable, don't speak too loud." But who decided that your silence was more acceptable than your truth? Awakening peels back those layers, and what you hear is not clarity, it's chaos. Competing demands, guilt that doesn't match your actions, shame that doesn't belong to you. It's like discovering your thoughts were hacked, and suddenly, you don't know what's yours anymore. This is where discernment becomes sacred. You begin to listen not just to your thoughts, but through them. You start asking, is this mine, or did I inherit it? And when the answer hurts, that's when you know you're close to something real. The mind you trusted is now suspect. You used to follow your thoughts like a map. Now, you realize most of them were written for someone else's destination. You start to rewrite, not just beliefs, but identity, not just patterns, but purpose. And the silence that used to scare you, it becomes holy. Because in that silence, your real voice, faint but unmistakable, begins to return. Not loud, not dramatic, just honest, just yours. The inner voice was never supposed to be a crowd. It was meant to be a compass. And post-awakening, you don't just change direction, you finally choose it for yourself. If the soul whispers, the ego screams, and it screams loudest when its survival is at stake. Awakening doesn't just show you the truth, it threatens everything the ego built to protect you from it. The ego is not your enemy, it's your shield. It's the part of you that learned how to navigate the world, how to avoid pain, how to stay accepted, how to survive. It wears your name, defends your image, guards your comfort. But the moment truth arrives, the ego panics. Because truth doesn't care about comfort, it cares about freedom. Jung understood this deeply. He knew that the ego is only a fragment of the psyche, not the whole. He warned that unless the ego surrenders to the deeper self, it becomes tyrannical. It clings to identity like its life support. It resists change not because it's evil, but because it's terrified. When you awaken, you begin to see how tightly your ego has gripped the steering wheel. It tries to control the narrative. It explains away your wounds. It distracts you from your shadow. It tells you you're fine, while your soul is screaming. And when you begin to pull away from it, it fights. It feeds you doubt. It demands validation. It clutches every label it spent years cultivating: smart, nice, successful, desirable, and dares you to let go. But the self doesn't argue. It waits. It watches. It lets the ego burn itself out until finally something in you breaks, not in weakness, but in surrender. That's the pivotal moment. When you no longer want to be right, you want to be real. When you'd rather be whole than impressive. When you trade control for truth, even if it costs you the identity you spent a lifetime curating. And it will cost you. Your ego will grieve. It will feel like a death, because in many ways it is. But what rises from that death is not chaos, it's coherence. It's alignment. It's the self, no longer buried beneath persona and performance. The ego was never supposed to lead. It was meant to serve. And when it finally bows to something greater, something ancient, something real, then and only then does peace begin to settle. Not because you've figured it out, but because you've stopped pretending you need to. There comes a point in awakening where the world around you starts to feel orchestrated. Not by chance, not by logic, but by something deeper, older. Something that's been living within you all along, waiting for you to notice. This is when the archetypes begin to surface. Carl Jung taught that the psyche doesn't just belong to the individual, it's shared. Beneath your personal story lies the collective unconscious, a vast inner architecture of symbols, patterns, and energies that every human carries. And within that space live the archetypes, universal characters, emotional blueprints that shape the way we think, feel, and dream. You meet the Heresy part of you that longs to overcome, to prove, to conquer. You meet the anima or animature, inner feminine or masculine, whispering through attraction, emotion, and projection. You encounter the wise old man or woman, the silent inner guide, who appears not in logic but in symbols, visions, and the strange knowing that comes without proof. And then there is the self, the center, the wholeness, the part of you that watches everything else without judgment. You don't summon these figures, they arrive, through dreams, through sudden urges, through characters in books or people you meet that feel eerily familiar, as if they're acting out something ancient. You start having conversations that echo myths you've never read. You make decisions you can't explain, and slowly, the line between your life and something larger begins to blur. You start to feel as though you're being lived, not in the passive sense, but in the sacred. as if a deeper part of you has taken the reins, guiding your journey not through logic, but through story. And that story isn't random, it's archetypal. You're no longer just a person, you're a pattern, a myth unfolding in real time. It's disorienting, because these forces don't speak in language, they speak in energy, symbols, and instinct. They don't ask for permission, they just begin to move. And you, for the first time, feel your small identity stretching, becoming part of something more ancient, more meaningful, more whole. This isn't metaphor, it's memory, something older than words rising through your skin, and once you feel it, you can't go back, because now you know you were never just you. It begins with dreams, not the fragmented static you used to forget upon waking, but vivid, haunting, electric visions that linger in your bones, a staircase that never ends, a wolf staring through the mirror, a voice calling your name from inside a forest you've never seen. You try to explain it, but language fails, because these dreams aren't just dreams anymore, they're messages, maps, warnings, invitations. The unconscious is no longer a background player. It's moved into the driver's seat, and you're no longer dictating the journey, you're decoding it. Synchronicities start to multiply. You think of a person, and they call. You speak a thought, and the song playing next finishes your sentence. You walk into a bookstore, and the exact title you need falls off the shelf. You tell yourself it's coincidence, but something deeper whispers, this is design. Jung believed the unconscious wasn't chaos, it was order waiting to be discovered, and when it takes the wheel, you begin to see just how choreographed your life has always been. Not in the way of destiny written in stone, but in patterns, in nudges, in signs you never noticed until now. This is where the old version of logic starts to break down. You used to believe only in what could be measured. Now, you're being guided by symbols, by feelings, by a language that doesn't speak to the mind but to the soul. And though it unnerves you, it also feels familiar, like you've been here before. You begin to suspect that your entire life has been scripted from a deeper place, not as fate, but as a process, a remembering. The unconscious has always known the way. You were just too busy trying to control it to listen. Now, you're listening. And what you hear isn't always comforting, but it's always real. You're no longer just responding to the world, you're participating in a dialogue with something unseen, something intelligent, something sacred. And yes, it's disorienting, because the ego is no longer at the wheel, but in its place there's something more vast, more ancient, the part of you that was dreaming this life before you were even born. You're not lost, you're being led, not by fear, but by the intelligence of your own soul. You think you're an individual, unique, autonomous, original, but awakening confronts you with a truth that is both terrifying and liberating. Much of who you believed you were came from somewhere else. Carl Jung called it the collective, unconscious, the vast inherited psychic structure that lives beneath every personal thought, every private dream, every cultural script. It's not personal, it's ancestral, archetypal. It contains the myths, traumas, instincts, and roles humanity has carried for centuries. And whether you know it or not, you've been playing a part in that script all along. Your fears, many of them were not born with you. Your desires, carefully molded by society's silent hand. Even your sense of what's normal or right or possible was shaped by forces older than your memory. You inherited more than just genetics. You inherited a blueprint, a collective agreement about how to be human, and you never signed it. You just obeyed it. Awakening rips that contract in half. You begin to feel the weight of every voice that's ever told you who to be, the pressure of norms you never questioned, the silent approval you chased without knowing why. And suddenly your identity feels less like a self and more like a collage. It's disorienting, because the person you thought was you starts to dissolve. You realize you weren't creating your life, you were imitating it, living inside borrowed dreams. Mirroring roles passed down through generations, following scripts written by systems designed to keep you small, tame, predictable. But here's the gift. When you realize you were never fully yourself, you finally have the chance to become so. The collective unconscious isn't your enemy, it's your origin. But now, instead of blindly following it, you begin to work with it. You question, you rewrite. You remember who you were before the world told you who to be. This is the terrifying liberation, the shedding of false selves, the abandonment of roles that never fit, the emergence of something raw, wild, and real. It's not about rejecting the collective, it's about no longer being ruled by it. You aren't just a product of the unconscious, you're the one waking up inside it. There's a moment in the awakening where nothing feels solid. You watch your life from the outside. Your body moves, but your mind feels detached. Familiar things feel foreign. Time distorts. You wonder if you're ascending or unraveling. This is where the line between awakening and dissociation begins to blur. You're not imagining it. You are split, but not broken. You've simply stepped out of the story you were fused with for so long, and now you're seeing it from the outside for the first time. The job, the relationships, the roles, the reflexes, they no longer feel like home because they never really were. But this disconnection is not a defect. It's the first stage of expansion, of peeling away from the false identity, the constructed ego, and meeting the deeper layers of self. And yet, it doesn't always feel noble. Sometimes it feels like insanity, like you've left reality behind and can't find the way back. Carl Jung understood this delicate threshold. He called the process individuation the journey of becoming whole by integrating the conscious and unconscious, the light and the shadow. But before integration comes fragmentation. Before coherence comes the split. You question if you're still grounded, if what you're feeling is growth or collapse, because the world keeps turning like nothing's changed, but inside everything has. You begin to feel like you don't belong, like you're floating between two worlds, no longer asleep, but not yet fully awake. This is not failure, it's transition. The mind, when stripped of its false narratives, doesn't know where to stand. It reaches for what's familiar, it grasps for logic, identity, control, but awakening dissolves those crutches. And in their place, it offers silence, space, depth, not to escape, but to rebuild, not to disconnect, but to reconfigure. Dissociation comes when the fragmentation becomes unbearable, when the pain of truth is met without compassion. But expansion comes when you allow the pieces to speak, to move, to reunite on their own terms. You're not losing your mind. You're losing the version of yourself that was never whole to begin with. And what comes next is not a return to who you were, but the discovery of who you've always been. Before awakening, your mind feels like the command center. It tells you what's true, what's safe, what's possible, and you follow without question. You analyze everything, measure everything. Try to think your way through pain, through confusion, through life. But awakening shatters that illusion, because suddenly the thoughts you once trusted don't feel as solid. They loop, they contradict, they cling to the past or panic about the future. And for the first time you realize something unsettling. Your mind isn't always on your side. Sometimes it's just scared. Carl Jung understood the psyche not as a hierarchy, but a constellation. And the mind in that constellation is not the sun, it's a mirror. It reflects what's already happening inside you, but it doesn't always reflect it clearly. It filters through memory, trauma, bias, fear. It bends truth into whatever shape feels safest. And so, post-awakening, you begin to listen differently, not with blind trust, but with curiosity. You stop assuming your thoughts are facts. You ask, who's speaking? Is this a reaction or a reflection? Is this clarity or is this old fear wearing a new mask? You learn that analysis has its limits, that overthinking can be a defense mechanism, that insight doesn't always come through logic, it often arrives in silence, in stillness, in the breath between thoughts. Stillness becomes your sanctuary, because in that space there is no script, no reflex, just presence. And presence doesn't demand an answer. It doesn't need to explain itself. It simply is. And somehow, that begins to feel more trustworthy than the loudest thought in your head. You're not abandoning your mind, you're reclaiming it, no longer ruled by it, no longer mistaking the voice of fear for the voice of truth. You use it as a tool, not a tyrant, a servant, not a master. Because the awakened life isn't lived from the head, it's lived from the whole, from body, from soul, from silence. And in that silence, you begin to see the mind for what it truly is, not the author of your life, but a mirror, reflecting what still needs to be seen. There's a moment in your awakening when something strange begins to happen. The people around you start changing, or so it seems. Friends become irritating. Loved ones trigger old pain. Strangers feel too loud, too fake, too much. You think they're the problem. But then the truth hits like a quiet explosion inside your chest. Carl Jung said, "Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves, not just because it's poetic, because it's a psychological law. What you reject in others is often what you've buried in yourself. What you admire is what you've disowned. What triggers you reveals you. And when you begin to awaken, those projections stop hiding. You start to see them raw, exposed, undeniable. That friend you think is too selfish, maybe you've been too self-abandoning. That person you think is arrogant, maybe they reflect the confidence you've been taught to suppress. The world becomes a mirror, and every reaction becomes a reflection. This is the part no one glamorizes. Because it's brutal, you realize how often you've made others responsible for your emotions, how many relationships you've sabotaged, not because of them, but because of the wound they activated inside you. You start to feel every judgment boomerang back into your own heart. And yet this is the beginning of freedom. Because when you stop projecting, you start owning. When you stop blaming, you start healing. You recognize that your triggers are not enemies, they're messengers. They carry the voice of your shadow, asking to be acknowledged. And the more you listen, the more clarity you gain. You stop reacting blindly. You pause, you breathe. You ask, what part of me is speaking right now? What part of me is still hurting? And slowly, life becomes less about defending yourself and more about discovering yourself. The people around you don't change. You do. You become less reactive, more honest, more responsible. Not because you've become perfect, but because you've stopped outsourcing your pain. Projection is no longer a prison. It becomes a path. Every trigger becomes a portal, and through it, you don't just see others more clearly, you finally begin to see yourself. After the chaos, after the unraveling, after the shadows, projections, an inner war, something begins to emerge, quietly, without fanfare. It's not another mask, not a role, not a performance. It's something you haven't felt in a long time, maybe ever. It's you. Not the version you were taught to be, not the one shaped by applause, rejection, or survival, but the one that was buried beneath it all. The one that remained untouched, even as the rest of you was molded. Carl Jung called this the self, not the ego, not the persona, not the fragments of identity we gather over time. The self is the totality, the wholeness, the integration of shadow and light, conscious and unconscious, the deep center that holds everything you are and everything you've yet to become. You don't find it in noise, you don't reach it by striving. It rises in silence. It reveals itself when you stop trying to be someone and start allowing yourself to simply be. It comes through intuition, a knowing that doesn't shout but resonates. It lives in presence in those moments where nothing is missing because you are finally with yourself. The authentic self doesn't seek validation. It doesn't compare or compete. It doesn't need to dominate or disappear. It just is. And when it begins to take form, you feel it in your body, in your breath, in the way you no longer betray your own knowing to make others comfortable. It's not always dramatic. Sometimes it's just a moment. You say no without guilt. You rest without apology. You speak without performance. And in that moment, you remember, this is who I am when I stop trying to be who I'm not. The self doesn't arrive fully formed. It unfolds, with every choice toward truth, with every silence you don't rush to fill, with every part of you you no longer exile. It's not about becoming better, it's about becoming real. And when that self begins to live through you, you don't just feel awake, you feel home. Not everything that looks like healing is healing. Not every insight is transformation. Not every quiet moment is peace. And not every awakening is real. Because in the world of self-discovery, there's a subtle, seductive trap, using spirituality to escape instead of integrate. It's called spiritual bypassing, and it's everywhere. You read the books, learn the language, speak of consciousness, alignment, frequency. You meditate, journal, let go. But inside, your body still carries grief. Your heart still avoids conflict. Your mind still clings to superiority disguised as clarity. And all the while, you tell yourself, I'm healed, I'm above this, I've transcended. But Jung warned us. One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. Not escaping it, facing it, feeling it, integrating it. Bypassing is comforting. It lets you avoid the messy parts, the rage, the trauma, the childhood wounds. It gives you permission to float above your pain instead of sitting inside it. You speak of non-attachment, but really you're numbing. You speak of forgiveness, but really you're avoiding confrontation. You chase light while quietly fearing your own shadow. But real awakening doesn't let you escape. It pulls you deeper, into your body, into your emotions, into the hard conversations, into the places where truth still hurts. Embodiment is the proof, not how beautifully you speak of the soul, but how gently you hold your anger, how honestly you say, I don't know, how willingly you show up messy, uncertain, real. Insight without integration is illusion. Wisdom without embodiment is empty. You can quote Jung, chant mantras, align your chakras, but if you're still afraid to feel grief in your chest, or rage in your gut, or longing in your bones, you're not awakening, you're hiding. True spirituality isn't about transcendence, it's about inclusion of every part, every wound, every fear. It doesn't lift you above your humanity, it invites you deeper into it. And that is the test. Will you use awakening to perform a more polished self to meet your real one? Because only one of those will ever set you free. After all the silence, all the unraveling, all the dark nights and quiet revelations, what remains? Not the mind you once trusted, not the identity you defended, not the answers you were so sure of. What remains is relationship. Because awakening does not give you control over the mind, it dissolves the illusion that you ever had it. You don't own your thoughts. You don't author your desires. You're not the master of your psyche. You never were, because the mind is not separates part of something far vaster. The ego wants ownership, but the soul wants alignment. Post-awakening, your task isn't to fix yourself. It's not to tame the unconscious or silence the shadow. It's to relate to the parts of you you once rejected, to the emotions you once buried, to the voice you used to drown in distraction, to the mind itself not as a god but as a guide. Carl Jung's final and most sacred lesson wasn't about healing, it was about wholeness, about living symbolically, not literally, about seeing the patterns behind the problems, about understanding that your life is not random, it's myth unfolding, it's psyche speaking, it's your unconscious begging to be known. You begin to live differently now. You listen for meaning, not just information. You speak not to impress, but to express. You move through life not seeking control, but coherence. You learn to feel your way instead of think your way through. You are no longer trying to conquer the mind. You are in conversation with it. Sometimes it whispers, sometimes it screams, sometimes it goes silent for days. But you no longer panic. Because now you know it's not the enemy, it's the mirror. And even though the world still demands performance, you no longer perform. Even though the ego still tightens its grip, you breathe and loosen. Even though fear still visits, you no longer run, you sit. You listen, you relate. Because the goal was never perfection, it was intimacy with yourself, with your soul, with life itself. You may not walk this world with more certainty, but you walk it with more truth. And that, finally, is enough. This story was brutal, but this story on the right-hand side is even more insane.